Robert Koopman, thank you very much for joining us at Asia House.
Thank you,
Let's
Mike.
start with the outlook for global trade in 2019. Do you expect a decline?
I expect global trade to slow, not decline. So a decline in growth rate, but not a decline in actual trade.
Is that driven by the trade tensions between the US and China and the knock-on effects of those tensions?
I think the main drivers are fundamental weakness in the macroeconomy. We see that in China, we see that in Germany. Europe is becoming concerning. Argentina, Turkey, there's a number of places where there's concerns around macroeconomic growth. And that macroeconomic growth usually explains about 75% of global trade growth. The policy aspect is about 25%, and that's where you start getting into the US-China trade conflict, those kinds of things. So it doesn't explain the vast majority of trade growth, although it can have very important effects.
So you do expect a slowdown in global economic growth over
Yes.
the next 12 months. There's some talk that potential recessions in Europe. There's talk that China's growth rate is overstated. What's your take on some of those component parts of global growth?
Well, very worried about Europe. We finally, in 2017, had synchronized growth after a number of years of uneven growth where some countries would start to fire on all cylinders, but then others would not. So 2018, we finally got this synchronized economic growth across the globe, largely. And now in 2018, it started to weaken. In 2019, it looks like there are significant warning signs for this year, particularly around Germany and Europe and China. I don't want to forecast very precisely, but those macro things are very concerning. There are steps that could be taken to offset some of these negative effects. It would be good if governments could find a way to coordinate their policy and make that happen. As you know, the US has been growing pretty strongly. There's concerns about how strong that growth, whether or not that strong growth can continue. And I'm one of those that shares those concerns. But as always, you have to wait till you see the numbers.
Yes.
Yeah.
So do you think there's a real risk of a recession in Europe?
I think there are growing signs. I don't want to say I'm forecasting a recession in Europe, but there are growing warning signs that give us pause and concern.
And the real growth rate in China, how do you read that?
So I think what matters more is the slowing growth in China. If the numbers that people are saying were overstated in the past and are overstated now, it's more these deltas. So how much has trade growth slowed, either based on the reported numbers if they were inflated, or the underlying real numbers? We see a slowdown in either of those. And it's that slowdown that matters more, I think, than whether or not the numbers were overstated in the past.
I'd like to turn now to the WTO itself. There's been a lot of pressure, especially from the US, to reform the WTO. Is there an appetite in the Secretariat for that reform?
The Secretariat supports members wherever they want to go. So I do think there is an appetite among members, more and more members, to have a very serious discussion about how they could improve the WTO, the multilateral trading system. And we in the Secretariat are happy to see that members are interested in that discussion, and we'll support it in any way that we can.
What sort of reform is required?
Well, that's not for me to say. That's for members to decide. But there are areas where they seem to be talking about reform. They seem to be talking about reform around the dispute settlement understanding and the role of the appellate body, around transparency and notifications. Some members want to talk about development status. Other members want to talk about how we deal with subsidies in this changing world. So there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of discussion. Not all members agree on which way to go, but compared to a few years ago, I think it's pretty clear that members feel the need to find ways to take the system forward.
I want to turn now to the US-China trading relationship. When we last met back end of November, tensions were at a high. Subsequently, there have been talks, and there's now talk of some sort of trade deal or some sort of resolution of those tensions. Do you expect there will be a meaningful resolution in the tensions between US and China?
What we hear from China and the US is that they are getting close, but there are still very substantial issues to be resolved. I think I'm going to wait until I see what comes out. There are areas where they seem already to, okay, we've agreed on this, but there are still some areas to go. I really don't know what the status is in these other areas, but it would be good to have this dispute resolved, but it would also be good to have the dispute resolved in a way that's consistent with the multilateral commitments of both members.
You've used the term in the past, managed trade, and that seems to be something of a no-no for WTO. Do you see more bilateral deals and regional deals where it's more a case of managed trade as opposed to free trade?
I don't think we see that in regional trade agreements and preferential trade agreements. Typically what happens is that while there may be some preferences between the members, a lot of the sort of regulatory commitments, a lot of the non-tariff measure things, it's very hard to discriminate against non-members in those areas. And I was mentioning earlier that only about 25% of global trade is actually conducted under those, under the preferences that are granted in those agreements. So 75% of global trade in goods is under WTO commitments, and that's a good thing. So what I see in RTAs is maybe some trade diversion and trade creation, but by managed trade, what I mean is I'm gonna promise to import a certain amount of a particular good from you, notwithstanding my commitments to other countries or suppliers that may have a better price. So that's where it could be a little bit concerning.
Which is one of the flavors of talks between the US and China.
That's what we hear. We haven't seen, the actual things, but that's what I'm hearing. Yeah. And then I think about MFN, most favored nation. You treat everybody the same. And so it will be interesting to see if there is an agreement. Does it contain those kinds of things? What do other WTO members have to say about that? How does it affect the global rules? That could be very interesting to see.
And finally, Brexit. The UK still hasn't decided whether it's going to leave the EU with a deal, whether it's going to leave without a deal, or indeed whether it's going to leave in the next few months or 2 years. It's unclear. What's your readout on the impact of Brexit under those different scenarios on UK and UK trade?
So a lot of the economic modeling that's been done is focused on changing trade costs, both observed trade costs that might occur on tariffs, but also in the regulatory areas, non-tariff measures, behind the border things. And that would suggest that the initial impact is going to be higher trade costs. The UK government has talked about going out there and aggressively pursuing free trade agreements that would then start to lower those trade costs. But it's gonna take a while to really be able to say what's going to happen to those. If they have a free trade agreement with the UK, if they have some sort of regulatory coherence, you could see not much of a change in trade costs. But if there isn't a free trade agreement, or if there isn't regulatory cooperation or coherence, then you're likely to see a change in those trade costs. But the UK government could also take steps to try to reduce some of those. So it's a very complex and fluid situation. I feel for all the players directly affected by this. I will say that the UK and the EU continue to participate in Geneva very proactively. The UK mission is being very proactive in trying to be clear and transparent as it can be with other members. So it's a difficult set of circumstances that the effects we have to kind of wait and see.
Robert Koopman, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.